This screencast is going to cover the topics of the Great Migration and the Harlem Renaissance. There are four essential questions you need to answer by the end of this screencast. What were the push factors of the Great Migration? In other words, what caused people to leave the South? What were the pull factors of the Great Migration? What attracted people to the North and the West? What is a Renaissance? And in what ways did the Great Migration lead to and or shape the Harlem Renaissance? Let's begin. In the 1917s, in 1917 America went to war in World War I, and at the end of that war, African American veterans who returned from Europe expected to be accepted into mainstream society due to their service. They served bravely, even though they were forced to be segregated, and actually many ultimately ended up serving for the French because of the massive amounts of racism by the American Army. Still, these returning soldiers expected to be welcomed back as heroes, like the rest of the soldiers would be. Unfortunately, their bravery and service to their country had little or almost no effect on the racist and violent system of segregation, intimidation, and disenfranchisement. And at this point, it's been about 40 years since the end of Reconstruction in 1877, and then 20 years since the Supreme Court enshrined segregation in Plessy versus Ferguson. And by this point, African Americans are fed up and tired of the lack of political rights and the lack of economic opportunities. And so, they voted with their feet. They left. The Great Migration stretches from 1910 to 1930. So as you can see by the dates, it actually begins before World War I. And continues into the 1930s. The Great Migration is the mass exodus. An exodus is like leaving, like you can see the word exo, that means to get outside of, right? So the mass exodus of African Americans who are leaving the Jim Crow South, leaving where segregation is illegal. Violence and discrimination in the South are some of the reasons why they wanted to leave, right? We've studied a lot of those already. And then one of the things that pulled people towards the North was the existence of many factory jobs and just the idea of new opportunities outside of the South. The World War I factories increased the goods that were being produced, and so there was a huge need for more workers. And African Americans started rushing to huge cities like Chicago, New York, St. Louis, Detroit. These cities received thousands and thousands, really in the millions, of African Americans, millions in total. Historians estimate that about 1.6 million African Americans left the South between 1910 and 1913. And here you can see some of their destinations. New York City is one of the major destinations. And it's important to note that while this was a huge improvement, and for many African Americans, they did not receive wonderful treatment in the North either. Right? Whole families left their homes in the South, taking whatever they could carry, looking for a better life. Imagine the courage it would have taken to just strike out and go somewhere where you may not even know anybody. It's pretty remarkable. Like I said before, it's important to understand that while there was an improvement for leaving the South, entering northern societies that had little or no experience with African Americans still resulted in widespread conflict. There was certainly a lot of discrimination from northern businesses and people, and as well as we can see in this picture of a lynching in Minnesota, there was still the terribly racist violence directed towards African Americans. As we said before, one of the main places the African Americans were to head would be New York, and this sparked the Harlem Renaissance. I left out the date here. The Harlem Renaissance is generally believed to be occurring in the 1920s. That's a rough estimate, but basically, a Renaissance is a rebirth a rebirth of old ideas, or bring up new ideas. So African Americans who get to the North, who have a wider amount of freedom, more opportunities than they had in the South, and they start to create Communities centered around African American arts and life. And so here you see a great picture on Strivers Row, uptown in Harlem. I love the look of the mink coat here and the beautiful Packard, or this is a Rolls-Royce limousine. Here's Duke Ellington. The Crisis was a magazine published by the NAACP and edited by W.E.B. Du Bois, who we've already talked about. So many African Americans were leaving the South and coming to the North to live in cities. Harlem, New York City, was becoming the center of black culture. Art, music, literature, drama, and scholarship all blossomed, and African American ideas and African American cultures started to become open to a wider audience. Here are some prominent, notable figures who did a lot of work during the Harlem Renaissance. Du Bois, we've already talked about. He was an educator, an intellectual, a scholar, and he was one of the original founders of the NAACP. Zora Neale Hurston is a wonderful author, as is Langston Hughes, author and poet. A. Philip Randolph was an organizer. He organized workers. He was also fought for civil rights. Duke Ellington, a very famous musician, lived and worked in Harlem. And then Marcus Garvey here is the founder of the UNIA, and his goal was to actually, he advocated for many African Americans to move back to Africa, believing that America would never be totally receptive to African American people. So again, here's there were literary magazines. These magazines would be published and spread throughout the country. So it wasn't just that this was occurring in Harlem. What happened in Harlem would spread across the country. So the words, the thoughts, the music spread around and created kind of a black consciousness in the 1920s, a shared heritage. Here we see some dance clubs up on Harlem, the Savoy, the Apollo, which is still there to this day on 125th Street. You have to understand that African Americans were being widely educated at this point. There's more opportunity in higher education back then than there had been in prior generations. Still, there was a lot of improvement that needed to happen. And then this is the photo we're going to end on. It proposes the idea right here of the new Negro. And for some people, they actually called the Harlem Renaissance the new Negro movement. Of course, back then, Negro was not a negative term. It would have the same way we say African American. And the idea of this new Negro is that they are not afraid of the intimidation. They are strong. They are creating culture. They are creating music and arts. And so because they were able in the Great Migration to leave the repressive, violent, fully segregated societies of the South, and then bring their stories and their ways of life and culture north, is one of the main positive effects of the Great Migration. All right, answer the questions below the screencast. Make sure you've taken all your notes and answered your questions, the essential questions. Thanks a lot.